On speaker. Hello, good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are in the world. This is Dave Rubenstein. I'm editor-in-chief of SD Times Magazine, and I'd like to welcome you to today's program. A comprehensive application security toolkit is essential. Before we get started today, I have a couple of quick announcements. There'll be a live question and answer period following the presentation. To ask a question, simply go to the control panel, find the box that says ask a question, type it in, hit submit, and we'll get to as many as time allows. Secondly, this will be available on demand in the next 24 to 48 hours on the sdtimes.com website, so you can play it over and over and over again to your heart's content and share it with your friends. Okay, as for the topic of application security, as we've been writing in SD Times, the amount of open source code in enterprise software today is much greater than it was 10 years ago, of course, and getting a grip on it can be difficult because developers don't always tell their managers what open source they're using or get permission or follow policies that are already in place. So today's webinar will take a look at how you can create an integrated and secure development lifecycle environment and reduce vulnerabilities using open source software. And now to get us started, I'd like to introduce Mike Pittenger from Black Duck Software. Mike has more than 25 years of management experience and 15 years in security in this space. He helped spin out Veracode from Symantec, was vice president at Cigital, and at Black Duck, he is responsible for strategic leadership of security solutions. And now I'll turn it over to you, Mike. Take it away.
Thanks, Dave. Thanks very much, everyone, for joining us. Hope you find this informative. Again, please feel free to ask questions as we go along. We are going to deal with open source, but we're also going to be dealing with other types of tooling. So when we look at, I was just at the RSA conference last week or last month, and many of you may have been there too, and you kind of get a little overwhelmed with the competing claims around all of the security products. But we see fuzzing tools, interactive security testing, runtime application security testing, dynamic analysis, static analysis, pen testing, so on. There are all of these tools out here, and it can be kind of daunting to try to figure out where to start and what is going to be effective and what's not going to be effective. And when we look at how people are going about their overall security spending, we see kind of an old school approach, and by old school I mean old fashioned, and looking at a world that used to be as opposed to the world we have today. So 10, 15, 20 years ago, it made a lot of sense to spend money in perimeter defense and trying to keep the bad guys out of your networks. And consequently, we saw a lot of attacks on and a lot of defending of the network layer. That doesn't make as much sense when you're exposing all of your IP and your assets through the application layer, but we still see that kind of backwards spending patterns of spending on perimeter defense, whereas most of the attacks are occurring on the application layer. So we see a disconnect there that really needs to be addressed. So what we're going to talk about today is some of the tools available, and we're going to try to do this under the context or keeping in mind a big goal for a lot of organizations is to try to move left. So this chart kind of represents more of a waterfall, but an SPLC where you've got analyze, design, implement, test, and maintain sections of that. And as everyone here on this call I'm sure knows, there are various security activities that you can conduct during each of those sections, and the further you go out, the higher it is the cost to remediate. So these aren't absolute dollars, as you can tell, but if there is something that you could theoretically fix during the design process for $1, if you fix that, if you find that same problem, it's going to cost you 100 times as much once that is in production out in the field and you're in maintenance mode. So we'll use this as a context to understand where each of the tools fits in and how we can try to start to move more left in the SPLC. So we'll get into tools. We're going to start with static analysis. This is kind of my time with Veracode. This is what we focused on a lot. It's referred to sometimes as white box testing because in most cases you will have access to the source code. In the case of some, it's a binary as well. And what this is doing is, these tools do is is analyze the code to build an intermediate representation of the software. So think of it as mapping out control flow, mapping out data flow, and you end up with this large model in memory of the application, and that model does nothing by itself, but you can run rules against it. So as an example, I could run a rule that said look for string copies, and then traverse the model to determine if in this instance of a string copy, whether it's possible for the source buffer to be larger than the destination buffer. If that's true, you've got a potential for buffer overflow. So it'll identify these and bring it down to the line in the source code where that vulnerability manifests itself. So the developer can then go to that line and attempt to remediate the issue. So this can be used pretty early in the SDLC. We typically see it in the coding phase, but really through build verification, because it can take a while to build this abstract syntax tree, this intermediate representation. So you may not want to do it with every single build. You might wait until you get a little bit further down the line on it. But a very effective tool, we use it internally at Black Duck. It's really good at finding common coding errors that can result in security issues in the code you write. Dynamic analysis is a little bit different. It's the tool a lot of companies start with because you can buy versions of this that are really point and click. It's as opposed to the white box testing where you have the source code. This is black box testing. It's more like how an outside attacker might be looking at your application. So typically what this will do is look for input fields if you're thinking about a web application. And when it finds those input fields, it might try to provide those input fields with values that the application may not expect. So, instead of putting in a password, what happens if I send 1,000 zeros and ones? What happens if I put in a SQL command? What happens if I combine those two to put in a password that I know is bad, but keep that command open through SQL commands and then put in 1 or 1 equals 1, which is always going to return true, kind of a classic test for a SQL injection. So again, very common tools, can be used by less skilled people, can be interpreted with a lot of effort because it will typically return a lot of results. By definition, these are used much later in the SDLC because you need to have a running application to use this. So you have an app that's running up in a staging environment. You probably have some data behind that so that it runs just like a real application. But again, very useful. And again, we use those tools here. IaaS, or interactive security testing, is trying to combine those two. So the vendors refer to these not as white box or black box, but as glass box. And essentially what you're doing is instrumenting an application so that as you go through your QA testing, you can monitor the behavior of the application as it's running and identify different security issues. So again, it requires a running application, so very late in the SDLC where it's going to be more expensive to remediate issues. Kind of a nascent market, but we're seeing a lot more adoption of it. Open source vulnerability management is what Black Duck does, and it's a relatively new addition in the SDLC. So as the code bases that we see become more and more reliant on open source, 30, 50, 75% open source, we have to recognize that, and we'll get into this in a little bit more detail, recognize that the other tools, these automated tools, while they're good at finding common coding errors, they're not really good at finding the issues in open source in the wild. And I can go into a little bit more explanation for that. But what these will do is analyze the code to provide a listing of the open source that's in use. And then once that occurs, we can, in our case, we can tell you anything you want to know about it because we track a couple million of these. What will surface automatically is license risk. So is this code that you're using issued under a GPL license, for example, where it might put your own IP at risk if you're redistributing the code. We'll surface security risk. So have there been security vulnerabilities reported against that version of the component, either publicly or privately? And the third metric that we focus on is operational risk. It's really a metric about how well supported that open source community is. So you might not want to work on Mike and Dave's nifty open source project or make that an integral part to a device that you distribute, because if it was just Mike and Dave doing it, maybe we get tired of it after a while and stop supporting it. and that leaves you essentially supporting your own, the open source in your code. So we're trying to surface information about, is this project effectively end of life? How many contributors are there? How many commits have there been in the last year, and so on. And this can be used throughout the life cycle. So it can be used to create policies during the planning phase, to select components that meet those policies during this design phase, and from the first commit, because it's much lighter overhead than static or dynamic testing, to alert organizations to the use of open source that violates those policies or have security vulnerabilities and so on, and continuously monitor these even after they're in production. So we want to touch on some of the challenges, and it's no secret that the world has, the software development world has changed over the last few years. We'll touch on all of these, but basically they come down to, we've got a lot more applications out there and a growing attack surface with mobile and IoT and so on. We've got new deployment models and new development models. So we have Agile's really taking off, and containers, so things like Docker containers. And this is going to have to lead to new strategies for how we address application security in these environments. And then finally, we just have the increasing use of open source. We see this virtually everywhere today, whereas it was not uncommon to see applications 10 years ago with little open source. Today, it's highly unusual to see applications that aren't at least 10% open source, and it's not uncommon to see applications that are 50% or more open source. So let's think first about the attack surface. So with the world, how it's connected today, when we think of the attack surface, we've been used to thinking of that in terms of web applications. But it's really not enough to just test those web applications, because the number of applications is increasing dramatically when you start to add on mobile, IoT, and so on. It gives the attackers, our adversaries, a lot more things to look for weaknesses in. Dan Geer, who, if you don't know him, you should. He's was the CTO at Stake years ago, and is now CTO at Incutel, which is the investment arm of the CIA. He spoke at RSA a couple of years ago, and predicted that the attack surface just in the IoT space is doubling every 7 months. And this is taking into account, not just UIs, but all of the cores that are being used, and the APIs for Bluetooth and web and so on and so on. The second thing we're seeing, I touched on, was containers and DevOps. So containers have been really useful to a lot of organizations. They accelerate time to market, essentially, for getting applications up and running. We can update the applications more quickly. We can respond quickly to newly discovered vulnerabilities. And containers are really unique in the way they can be identified and tracked, so that as you deploy systems, you feel like you have greater visibility into what you're using. But they also present some unique challenges, like any other changing environment. So with containers, you have a lot more individuals who can be involved in the creation of a container or the application and the Linux stack that application is running on top of. A lot more people than you would have in a traditional system. And if you have a problem in a given container, it can manifest itself across multiple containers. So let me explain that for a second. The way containers operate, as I'm sure many of you know, is you have a kind of a lightweight stack, typically a Linux stack. And you can, that's one layer, and then you might run an application layer on top of that. If you want to deploy a new application, you can take that base container, strip off the application layer, and apply a new application layer without changing that underlying Linux stack. So what happens if you have a problem with that stack? Well, about a year and a half ago, we looked at the approved containers on Docker Hub and found that well over half of them had vulnerabilities in the Linux stack. Now, it was typically the same vulnerability, but that just makes my point. Somebody had taken a Linux distro, in this case, it had an old version of OpenSSL with the Heartbleed vulnerability, and because they were just stripping off application layers and putting on new application layers, they were just propagating that underlying vulnerability across every application that they ran. So you need to have visibility into this, with all of the advantages that containers and DevOps and so on can provide. Visibility to the stuff you're using remains critical. And that really leads us into open source. So it wasn't unusual when Black Duck was founded in 2002 to see people trying to get away from open source. In fact, a lot of our customers bought our software because they needed to identify the open source so they could pull it out of their applications. And that's completely changed now. We have a lot of customers who use us every day in every build, and they're doing it just to make sure that they're using the right open source. Open source offers so many advantages in terms of lowering development costs and accelerating time to market that people are obviously embracing it, but it can also get into your code base in a lot of different ways. So, if we're building an application, we think of it typically as a developer going and understanding they need some level of functionality, pulling an open source project down from GitHub or SourceForge or the project homepage and building it in. And that's indeed a lot of how it often gets in. But it can also get in through outsourced development, where an outsourcer is highly motivated to use open source because of the advantages around cost we just mentioned. If you're using commercial components, we issued a study last year that showed that the average commercial application is 35% open source. So if you're using commercial software, you're using open source. Finally, if you're using building components and rebuilding them or reusing them internally, you're going to have a lot of open source there. So again, in commercial applications, we see that it's about 35% open source. For internally developed applications that are used internally, so when we're building components that we're going to use ourselves, it's not unusual to see 75 or 80% open source. And while this is great, there are open source software, so there are vulnerabilities in it. This chart is a representation of the vulnerabilities just in open source software, and if the white bar are those that were disclosed in the National Vulnerability Database that NIST maintains, and those in blue are additional vulnerabilities that Black Duck maintains in its knowledge base from other sources, let's just say. And these can be mailing lists, discussion threads, deep web, and so on. So we see the number of vulnerabilities going up. Now, this isn't a matter, in my opinion, of open source being less secure or frankly more secure than commercial software. I mean, it's software, so it's going to have vulnerabilities. But there are some characteristics about it that make it vulnerabilities in open source particularly attractive to attackers. First of all, it's freely available. So if you have a vulnerability in something like OpenSSL or Linux or the one most recently in Struts 2, it becomes a target-rich environment for an attacker. If we again focus on this Struts vulnerability from a week or two ago, there are also proofs of concept out there for how to exploit that vulnerability. So now we've lowered the skill level required on the part of our adversaries. There are probably YouTube videos that show you how to do this. But the biggest thing is really twofold. Number one, most companies aren't aware of when they're using all of their open source. And number two, they're not tracking it for vulnerabilities. So it goes without saying that if you don't know that you have a vulnerability, you can't protect yourself against it. But it's really because this gets in so quickly and because the support model is different. So when we use a commercial component in our applications, we have an SLA, a service level agreement with that vendor. So if I license this software, the vendor is obligated to answer my questions. If there's a update to it, they're going to push that to me. If there's a security vulnerability in it, they're going to notify me about that and push me a patch or push me an update that fixes that. Open source is exactly the opposite. When we elect to download and build that component into our code, we're now responsible for tracking its ongoing health. Nobody's going to, unless we have a support agreement like you might with Red Hat or somebody like that, it's up to you to track that component and its ongoing health. So if there's an update to it, you've got to know about that, and then you've got to read about it and figure out whether or not you're going to pull that into your code. If there's a security issue, you can find out through pretty consistent monitoring of the project homepage or through NVD. But again, you have to make a decision or not whether that's acceptable risk or unacceptable risk, and decide whether or not you're going to pull that update into your build. So it's really a push versus a pull model. And because open source can get into the code base in so many ways, and because we're using so much of it, I mentioned 35% of the average commercial application, that represented over 100 distinct components. And now you're looking at 2 to 3 to 4,000 vulnerabilities every year. That becomes hard for a single application, monitoring the ongoing health of 100 components. What if you get 10 applications or 100 of your bank? You may have thousands of applications in your inventory, and that quickly becomes very difficult. Now, one of the most common questions we would get from people when we tell new customers, new companies what we do is, well, I'm using static analysis or I'm using dynamic analysis. Don't I have this covered? I mean, I'm analyzing that portion of the code. If I've got an open source engine or a static analysis engine, the open source is being analyzed as part of that. And the short answer is no, they don't. And it's not because they're not trying to. It's just because they're not perfect. They're good, but they're not perfect. And the types of vulnerabilities we see in open source are simply too complex to be identified by these automated tools. So this graph on the right here, the Venn diagram, it represents an exercise we went through in the early days of back at Stake and Veracode, and that is the black circle represents all known CWEs, so common weakness enumerators, as defined by NIST. So these are all of the weaknesses that you could have in software that could result in a security issue. And we went through these one by one, and for each we said, theoretically, is it possible to identify this weakness with static analysis? Did the same question with dynamic analysis, and then could it be found by a security researcher? And you can see, I don't remember the exact numbers, but say it was 300 out of 600 or 350 out of 600 that theoretically you could identify with static analysis, and a similar overlapping number with dynamic analysis. Then there's this whole world of vulnerabilities, weaknesses that couldn't be even theoretically identified by either. And open source vulnerabilities fall into all of these categories. And even when you are covering a class with one of these tools, it's not necessarily a given that you're going to find these. So things like SQL injection, buffer overflow, cross-site scripting would fall into that overlapping part of the Venn diagram where theoretically you could find them with either tool. But then, along comes Heartbleed. In the code base for 2.5 years, tested thousands and thousands of times by all of these engines. It was a buffer overflow. It was finally found by a security researcher. Theoretically, any of those tools in the Venn diagram should have been able to find those. But again, it took smart researchers to go and dig into it, identify the problem. I think they ended up using, they saw some code that looked squirrely and ended up using a fuzzer to accelerate their research and find the problem. But again, we have all these different bugs, and example after example of these issues not being found by static analysis. We can talk about Heartbleed in the code base for about 2.5 years, shell shock in the code base of Bash for over 25 years. The struts bug that just came out was in the code base for over 2 years. So you could argue that these are too complex of vulnerabilities to be found. You could argue that some of these code bases have gotten bloated and it's impossible for any tool to follow the control flow and the data flow and build that intermediate representation. But in either case, the vulnerabilities aren't being found by automated tools. So what do we talk about doing? We talk about building security in, and we'll try to keep the recommendation side of this pretty simple. So you have to take into account new development environments like Agile, like DevOps, and you can't treat security the same as you used to. You can't have a development team, build functionality, throw it to QA, have that bug testing done, and then ship it over the transom to the security team so they can parachute in and run their magic tools on it. You need to involve security early in the process and involve them in the Agile team so that you're testing for security and know what you should be testing through accurate security requirements, through good threat modeling, and so on. We want to move earlier into the SPLC, and that means giving development the tools and the responsibility that they need to have a greater security focus as they go forward. So, this might be IDE plugins that can do, in our case, look for open source components that contain security vulnerabilities, or perhaps that have licensing issues that you might not want to take on, and then baseline, track everything. If I guess it was Deming said, if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. So again, track everything that you're using as you go forward, and use the right tools for the right code. So if we accept as a best practice, I guess, that organizations are going to be doing security requirements along with functional requirements, and that they might be doing threat modeling, kind of thinking like an attacker, seeing how you who know the code might approach it as an adversary. That's going to help. But then use the right tools for the right job. Recognize that you need things like static and dynamic analysis to work on the code you write. But also, as open source becomes a bigger and bigger foundation of your application, recognize that you need tools that can identify that and track its use, and that the automated tools like static and dynamic and interactive and RASP and so on are simply ineffective against identifying open source and identifying vulnerabilities in open source. Now, I'll acknowledge the exception before somebody else points it out for me. There are certain tools that will have specific rules for a vulnerability. So we saw yesterday that the Canadian Revenue Agency had to take down their website last Friday, I think it was, for a day and a half. And it's because they had this, they acknowledged that it was this struts vulnerability in the file upload function. Now, that was quite some time after the vulnerability was publicly disclosed. So what we speculate is they had a tool like a dynamic analysis tool, but more in the form of a Metasploit or a Nessus tool from Tenable that you could load up with a rule for that specific vulnerability, and then they pointed at everything in their environment, and it will come back and tell you whether that's true or not. Now, they had a similar rule for Heartbleed. Take my word for it, they don't have a rule for every one of the, I think it's 80 or 90 new vulnerabilities that have been disclosed in OpenSSL since Heartbleed. So they're not covering everything. They're typically covering patches for things like Linux or these big ugly vulnerabilities, and they're very reactive. So in this case, the Canadian Revenue Agency could use it to identify some applications, some web apps they had that needed to be updated. Had they a good inventory of their open source in all of their applications, it simply would have been a matter of looking up that component and seeing which bills of material that component was associated with. They might still use something like Metasploit or Nessus to determine exploitability, but rather than doing it at everything in their environment, they could do it at just a few known applications. And by the way, when a new vulnerability comes out tomorrow, they're going to have to go through the whole exercise again with the new rule because they have no memory. They have no, in our case, bill of materials of what's being used. So in a fully laid out environment, this is the type of thing we look at. You'd have some level of security intelligence about vulnerabilities, about new threats in both open source and in commercial applications. You'd be using open source identification, so source composition analysis is a common term for it, to build policies and then enforce those policies, put controls in place so that a developer can't slip something in or use the wrong version of an approved component that may have vulnerabilities in it. And then for your custom code, use static and dynamic analysis. Do manual penetration testing. The rest of these are really going to vary depending on the application criticality or the criticality of the application. And every organization will risk rank their applications to focus on those that could cause the most harm to the company's goals should they be hacked. So the resources that are warranted for every application are going to differ from application to application and from company to company, depending on that company's appetite for risk. So this is really just a different view of it. Down towards the bottom, we have some traditional SPLC activities around things you would do to ensure build security in to have more secure code. So again, design requirements, threat modeling, using appropriate tool, deprecating unsafe functions, dynamic analysis, fuzz testing, and so on, and then having an incident response plan. Again, going back to the Canadian Revenue Agency, that's what we saw in effect last week. They recognized that they had this vulnerability in open source, and their incident response plan called for taking that down and remediation. And then again, around open source, understanding your risk assessment for each application. So risk ranking your applications, understanding what technical impacts are most critical to you on each application. So if you're Twitter, the worst case scenario may be a denial of service attack. If you're Dyn, the DNS provider that was attacked and through the botnet of IoT devices last fall, certainly an IoT attack is the worst case scenario. Excuse me, a DDoS attack is the worst case scenario. Now, if you're not an online bank, DDoS attack might be bad, but it's not the worst case scenario. If it's your online banking application, you'd probably prefer that be unavailable rather than have an attack that might be able to execute arbitrary code or read or modify data and so on. So the technical impacts are somewhat finite, and if you can understand those, it'll help you better understand which types of vulnerabilities are most important to you. And then finally, in the continuous integration environment, as we try to get into a more agile world, every organization is going to look a little bit differently. I mean, almost everybody's going to have an IDE and a version control system. They may have a bug tracking system. What we think is important here is to try to automate this as much as possible. And the orchestration of that can come through a CI server, something like a Jenkins or a TeamCity. And if you can integrate with those, you'll see things like, Black Duck integrates with those. A lot of the static analysis tools will integrate with those into the build process. So you start a build, it'll kick off an open source scan, and in addition to a static analysis scan. You can do dynamic and static and interactive analysis in the QA tools. You're probably not going to manage the vulnerabilities through those tools themselves, but integrate those with something like a Jira or a Bugzilla, some sort of a bug tracking system. If you're using containers, you're probably doing a lot of the testing during the SPLC. We recommend strongly doing a last-minute check before you launch a container, looking at both the application and the Linux layer to make sure that nothing has changed since you completed the SPLC. And then finally, to keep this theme of moving left, IDE integrations can help a lot. You can give the idea here is to give developers both the tools and the responsibility for doing as much of the security testing as you can. And you're balancing that with trying not to slow them down too much, because at the end of the day, they're still being paid to deliver functionality. If you look in Black Duck, when we analyze code, the output of that analysis is a laundry list. We call it a bill of materials of all the components. And again, we're mapping information from our knowledge base on over 2 million open source projects to provide information around license risk, security risk, and operational risk. And you can see some of the examples here. So you can see that in this case, Apache Tomcat is a pretty bad component to have in the code base. So we would provide recommendations on that as to what you can do to fix that issue. What version should you go to? So the key takeaways here, we ask, just recognize the fact that the application development environment is changing. We've got new tools available, we've got new methodologies, and we have to adapt to that. As open source becomes an increasingly large component of your applications, recognize that it needs a different type of testing. So it's not going anywhere. It's only likely to become a bigger part, as we see the U.S. government being required to open source something like 20% of the code that is built for them each year. We're going to have more and more components and more functionality available to us, and we should embrace that, but do so while keeping track of what we're using. So you need visibility to the open source that you're using, and you need visibility to the threat environment, to understanding how this is during the SPLC and afterwards. So as you know, just because something is secure the day you ship it, that can all change overnight. So as part of Black Duck's service, we're providing continuous monitoring so that as new vulnerabilities are disclosed, you can get alerts. So going back to like the struts or the heartbleed thing, rather than looking at every application that you're building or pointing Metasploit at everything in your environment, you can simply, in the case of heartbleed, type in OpenSSL and see immediately every version in your environment and which applications use each version. And that concludes it. The formal presentation. I'm happy to take any questions you might have, and provide more information.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Mike. I want to remind everybody that now is a good time for them to type questions in, and we'll get to as many as time allows. But first, let me start with a question for you, Mike. And the question is, why are more vulnerabilities being found over the past few years? Is it simply a function of more open source software being used in enterprises?
Yeah, that's a good question, Dave. We hear that a lot. So I don't have it in this presentation, but it's interesting that the number of vulnerabilities in commercial code actually was larger. The number of reported vulnerabilities was larger in the National Vulnerability Database last year than those for open source. So it's not a question of the open source being less or more secure, frankly, than the commercial code. I think the biggest thing is we have more awareness to it, and we have more people who can do the testing. So if you think back, 10, 15 years ago, there were not a lot of people out there who were capable of doing a manual code review for security. AtStake built a nice business around providing those people. Today, we're minting them on a daily basis. We have a security research team in Belfast in the UK, and we're working with Queen's University there. They have both a master's and a PhD program in cybersecurity. So as more and more people are capable of finding these things, we're going to see more and more vulnerabilities disclosed, and it's making the code base more secure overall.
Mm-hmm. All right. That's excellent. So another question I want to throw out is kind of along the same lines. So what is the best way to deal with changes in third-party services that your application relies on that could open the door to vulnerabilities and malicious activity?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that?
Yeah, the best way to deal with changes in third-party services that your application may call into and rely on. How do you deal with changes in those services that could open the door to malicious activity?
So if you're talking about
you're not developing the code, you're just bringing code in.
Yeah, so if you're talking about open source components, the best thing you can do is as I mentioned, understand what you're using down to the version level, and then studiously track those for new issues. If you're talking about APIs that you might be calling on, we typically see APIs as an attack vector rather than as an inherent vulnerability. So again, having visibility into what your code is doing is going to allow you to defend yourself irrespective of the type of threat that it presents. Just as understanding that you don't want random code to be able to be uploaded and executed in your application. You want to know what APIs you're using, and whether they're outbound or inbound, and then if you are tracking your open source closely and understanding the threats. It occurs to me now, perhaps what they meant was transient dependencies. So if I'm using an open source component that requires additional open source components, and those will be pulled in automatically, you certainly need visibility to that, and Black Duck does that by tracking open source in 3 different ways. We're looking at what's being declared as being needed. We're being what's is required by components that are both declared and found, and we do it by analyzing the code down to the file level to get a complete picture of what an application is using, not just what is being declared to be used.
Right. Interesting. So one of our attendees asks if you folks have evaluated the open source trusted execution environment, opt-T, I guess, and if you've evaluated and what you think of it.
I'm afraid it's a short answer. I've not evaluated it.
Okay.
But if I see the person requesting that, I'll look into that and I'll try to respond after the call.
Very, very good. Okay. So another question, again, more philosophical. Do you feel that more people poring over various code bases makes them more or less secure?
So I think this is a trick question. I'm not. So it does both, I suppose. I mean, it depends on if you're practicing responsible disclosure or not. You know, the risk with open source, such as it is that the bad guys have access to the code base also, and that they can find vulnerabilities to exploit, and that they won't report them to the open source communities. But you know, when we think about all of these, you know, as I mentioned, newly minted security people coming out of colleges and universities, they have an interest in this field, and Oracle's not going to turn over their code to them to look for bugs. So if you want to do you know, code reviews, the only environment you have to practice in is the open source community, and that's, you know, we look at those 3,000 or 4,000 vulnerabilities disclosed every year in open source. Virtually all of those are from you know, individual security researchers or small teams of researchers, and you know, they are practicing their skills, or you know, perhaps they're thinking of using a component internally, or they're just in it for fame and fortune sometimes. But you know, they're doing manual code reviews and they're looking at things until they see something that they think is squirrely. And then, you know, they may use a fuzzer, they may use other methods for determining whether or not there's actually a vulnerability there or not. But that, you know, that's their world. And when they do those responsible disclosures, it does, you know, it improves the overall quality of the code base. There used to be a lot of talk about, you know, open source is better because the many eyes theories. And when you have thousands of eyes looking at the code base, it's going to be a better code base. And I think that helps, but it depends, you know, from a security standpoint, it really depends on whose eyes they are. If they're security eyes, it certainly helps. If it's developer eyes thinking about, you know, efficiency or thinking about features, you know, perhaps they're just ignoring or have no awareness of the security issues. So I guess I'll cop out and just kind of say a yes answer to that. It could make it less secure if it's the bad guys finding things. It could be, but in most cases, I think it's more secure because we see these thousands of vulnerabilities that are being publicly and responsibly disclosed every year.
I agree with you. I think that more eyes make it more secure. That would be my take as well. A couple of technical things. Someone wants to know if there is a Black Duck API published anywhere that can be used.
Yeah, there is, and we have when we do integrations, we also open source those integrations. So we have a well-documented API. So you know, if you want, you know, you want something to kick off you know, a Jira alert every time some function happens, you can do so. If you want to you know, integrate it with you know, a particular kind of, you know, maybe a homegrown build server, you can do that. So yeah, we have a well-documented API, and again, a lot of our integrations are out there on GitHub and open source.
Mm-hmm. And someone wants to know if there's an integration with Microsoft.NET development, if it's easy to plug in your tool into Microsoft.NET technology development.
It will be shortly. We've got an Eclipse IDE plugin right now, and if you're talking about Visual Studio, that'll be coming shortly. We do have integrations with you know, other Microsoft products.
Excellent. Okay, so I would like to remind people we still have a few minutes to go. If you want to ask a question of Mike, just type it in and we'll get right to it. But here's a question that I have. When you're bringing in code that's already written, how do you, as you say, shift left with that in your own application development? Do you take it as if you've created it yourself and run it through the same kind of rigorous testing you would if you had developed it yourself? Or I'm curious to know how that shift left with open source works.
Well, if it's commercial software that you are acquiring and you're assuming that there's open source in it, which is a pretty safe assumption, it's not really the same type of thing. You risk opening yourself up to a lot of legal liability if you start to run somebody else's code through analysis. So we're working on source code and jar files and WAR files and so on. So we're looking at build input, build output. But if you were to try to do binary analysis of somebody else's code, that is usually thought of as reverse engineering. So the easiest thing to do is to ask for a list of the components that are being used. I mean, unless the vendor is risking violating copyright law, they need a comprehensive list of all of the open source they're using, not because they necessarily have to declare it, but they have to know whether they need to declare it or not, depending on the license that it's issued under. If you're an organization with enough buying power, like some of our customers, you can have your vendors submit code for analysis and request a bill of materials.
Right. I was thinking more of developers that will go online and just copy and paste some code that they find someplace and then bring it in. And if that's something, then that could be more rigorously tested than, as you say, going out and buying a commercial open source package. Yeah,
so you can certainly do that depending on your level of interest. Our tools can go down to identify snippets. But what we're doing, just to be clear, so what the static analysis tools are doing is, I mentioned, building this intermediate representation and so on. That's hard work. I mean, it's really complicated stuff. It takes a lot of time. It's subject to a lot of false positives and so on. What we're doing is somewhat simpler in that we're looking for what is being declared, perhaps in a package manager. We're looking at the files, so we're doing hashes of the files, the directory structures, metadata, and then matching that to our information, our knowledge base. We're effective at that because we've been doing it for so long with so many components. I mean, a lot of the stuff we match isn't publicly available anymore, but it may be sitting in somebody's binary repository or workspace. And then C, we look at the dependencies that are required by those components that we've identified. So if you go and pull down a random component, we'll likely match that. If you're looking at code snippets, you're going for a much more granular level of detail. Now we can do that, but it's most often used for license compliance. I want to make sure I didn't, if I grab something out of a textbook, I didn't violate that guy's copyright on that material. From a security standpoint, snippets are less of an issue, or really a non-issue, because if I'm using OpenSSL and there's a vulnerability in it, I'm probably subject to that vulnerability. If I'm using 100 lines from OpenSSL, I'm probably not going to be triggering that vulnerability. Does that make sense?
Interesting point. Yes, absolutely. Very, very good answer. All right, so it appears that we're out of questions. I'd give you 30 seconds, if you would, for a wrap-up or a key takeaway for our attendees today. So how about a final thought, Mike?
Yeah, thanks. So, again, the point we're trying to make here is open source is great value. It's lowering development costs. It's accelerating time to market. It's being embraced by your vendors, and if you're developing code, it ought to be embraced by you. There can be risks. I mean, we're seeing 2,000 or 3,000 vulnerabilities each year, but you can really mitigate that risk simply by understanding what you're using and keeping track of the ongoing hygiene of those components. So if you're looking for, kind of a what can I do tomorrow activity, I'd say go talk to your head of development or talk to your head of security and ask them if they have policies for what types of open source and third-party code can be used in applications. Ask them if they can produce a list of those. Ask them how they can compile that list, And most importantly, how do they make sure nothing gets through? You know, when you tell a developer they can use Project Foo version 5.2, how do you make sure that they heard that complete sentence and they're not just grabbing a 3-year-old version of Project Foo because they happen to have it in their workspace? And then finally, ask them how they track for issues in these components over time. And I think that'll give you a lot of insight as to how you're using open source, and more importantly, how you're controlling your use of open source.
Outstanding. Okay. Thank you very much, Mike. I'd like to thank you for your presentation today. It was fantastic. And I also would like to thank Black Duck Software for sponsoring today's presentation. And of course, I'd like to thank all of our attendees who have been with us the entire time. So once again, thanks everybody. And until next time, Dave Rubenstein saying so long.
Thanks, Dave.